I realize there's a lot of really good talks on right now, so I'd just like to say thank you for coming along to this one. It really means a lot to me to see a few people here that care as much about this as I do. Probably be polite to start a little bit about who I am and why I'm here to talk. My name is Norman Noble. I've been software engineering, or working in software engineering for probably about 25 years now, which when I say that out loud makes me feel really, really old. I'm originally from a place called Aberdeen. Does anyone know where that is? Yeah, it's in the northeast of Scotland. It's famous for some really strange things like deep frying absolutely everything. So if you haven't had a deep fried pizza, go to Aberdeen, you'll get one of them really easily. When I started working back, it would have been around about the mid-90s. I started work at ISP in Scotland at the time. And then eventually, like everyone in Aberdeen, I ended up moving into the oil and working for BP, doing a bunch of stuff in digital oil field. Yeah, I did that for maybe about 12 years or so. About 10 years ago, my wife and I were sort of thinking about what we wanted to do, where we wanted to live. So we migrated to Australia. Does anyone know where that is? Yeah, it's Melbourne. It's probably about as opposite as you can get of Aberdeen. Melbourne's got fantastic food, great wine. It's a really good sporting city if you like Formula One, tennis, that's on right now. It's a great place to go live. And when I got there, obviously I needed to find a job. When I got to Australia, I found out that a company called Seek were basically the jobs board of Australia. It's very different to how it is in the UK, where you've got lots of different job boards for lots of different reasons. In Australia, kind of Seek is the jobs board that has captured most of the market. So to cut a longish story short, I had a couple of jobs when I first got there. I actually ended up working for Seek as a company, which was, or has been, a really incredible experience. It's a really progressive company. They've actually been around for 20 years. They originally disrupted the printed media for job postings, and yeah, it's been a really exciting time working there in a variety of different roles. About a year ago, an opportunity came up to try something else. So a role came up within Seek. It has companies, it's quite a large company. It's bought up a bunch of other jobs boards around the world. One of those is what's called Seek Asia, which is JobStreet and JobsDB, which are the two largest operators in Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, that whole region. So about a year ago, an opportunity came up. They needed some help. We're bringing the Australian and Asian systems together, so they wanted me to go out there. So I floated the idea with my wife. The kids are still quite young, so we headed out there. I've been in Malaysia for about 6 months now. There's not a huge amount I can tell you about yet, other than it primarily has 2 seasons. It's either really hot or really hot and wet. And it's got, again, like Melbourne, it's got amazing food. But what I'm loving about Malaysia is the proximity to Southeast Asia. Within 2 hours, I can be in Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Borneo. So it's a really exciting place to stay. I'm learning a lot about different cultures and different people. And I've also got a great opportunity to help my family travel around the region a little bit. So that's about me. The reason I kind of wanted to cover this a little bit was to kind of highlight that I've had a bit of a varied career. I've worked in a lot of different places in a lot of different parts of the world. So I thought it was worth calling out. So why are we here to talk about hiring engineers? I'm going to assume everyone here is hiring engineers in some capacity or other. Yeah, OK. And just out of interest, are you actually using this conference as a means of networking and reaching out to developers that you meet? Does anyone actually feel like they've successfully met and convinced somebody to come join them here? Anyone? Oh, OK. Interested. Neither have I. We're here to talk about hiring. Primarily, I mean, hiring is really important. It's a really obvious statement, but organizations can't function without people. Especially in the software engineering market, it's quite a fluid market. So, for the longest time, there have been more jobs than there are people. So engineers have got a lot of options. They tend to move around quite a bit. So if you have an engineering team or you look after an engineering department, chances are you probably have to hire quite frequently. It's also super hard. When I first started hiring, there was no guidebook, there was no introduction into how to do it, what the best practices were. We kind of just had to learn it on our feet. I quickly realized that things are hard because there's not really a generally accepted definition of what a software engineer actually is. some people will, say that you're not an engineer unless you've got an engineering degree, or if you're not a member of this body. But realistically, anyone with an internet connection, some time, and the inclination can become a software engineer by somebody's measure. So if you can't really define what it is very easily, it's very hard to test for it. So hiring engineers is just a complicated, hard process. And it's not something that I find a lot of people talk about. It seems to be this thing that if you're a hiring manager, we all kind of struggle with, but nobody actually really shares. There's a bit of a weird vibe I find that when I talk to other companies. I was recently lucky enough to have a trip to Facebook, and I was asking them about the hiring practices, and they just clammed up. They just didn't want to discuss it, and it was a very close, personal, private thing. So I kind of feel like if it's something that's hard and it's something that's important, then it's probably worth trying to share it with some other people, because if we can find ways to make it a bit easier, then we should be trying to share that. So where will I start? So as I mentioned, I've been in software engineering for around about 25 years. I only really started hiring in earnest around about 10 years ago, after I moved to Australia. And it was simply, the situation I found myself in was the team I was a part of were hiring. Norman, can you jump in this interview? And literally, I jumped in, and I had no idea what to do at all. I had no questions prepped. I was there, and it was a very intense moment for me. That was pretty much how it started. It evolved. I got slightly better, but I always had this underlying feeling that I wasn't particularly good at it, and that it was a bit risky to have me in interviews, and there was very good chances I was going to be making bad hires. And that's pretty much what my experience of hiring was for quite a few years. 3 years ago, whilst at Seek, one of the teams that I worked on was what we would call a people ops team. So we kind of worked in multiple teams at the same time. And the people ops team did a lot of people stuff. We designed the grad program. We looked at career ladders and career progression. We looked at learning and development programs. And one of the things we looked after was hiring. And we kind of knew that Seek had a bit of a bad reputation in the market for hiring. It's known locally in Melbourne as the mill. If you want to get a job at Seek, you've got to go through the mill to actually get a job there. So we knew it wasn't great, but we weren't really focusing on trying to make it better. We kind of thought it was good enough. But then midway through 2017, we had this strange situation where, for some reason or other, we'd had a significant budget underrun. We had a lot of money in our budget for the rest of the year, and I can't remember whether something hadn't cost as much as it was supposed to, or we just hadn't done what we said we were going to. But we had this large amount, and there was a big debate about what was going to be done with it. And what they eventually decided was we had quite an aggressive product roadmap. There was a lot of things that we wanted to get to, but we just couldn't. So we decided that, or somebody decided, sorry, that we were going to hire 25 engineers and spin up 5 new teams simultaneously, which was a pretty terrifying prospect at the time. I was working closely with a team in our HR called Talent Acquisition and trying to get an understanding, okay, if we have to do this, when do we have to do this by? And the feedback was, well, this has to be done in the next 3 months, which made it even scarier because, if somebody's got to give at least a month's notice, that really means you've actually got to do it in 2 months. And we were at the start of the first month. So we did a bit of analysis. We looked at our current hiring approaches and trends, and we worked out if we were to keep doing it the way that we'd been doing it up until this point, it was going to take over 2 years to fill that 25 positions, just at the rate that we were getting through it. We were also really concerned that if we just focused on actually speeding up, we might actually take a hit in the quality, and that was something that we really wanted to keep a focus on if we were going to do anything in this space. So what I'm not going to talk about today is I'm not going to stand here and say that we had this crazy task and we came up with this amazing blueprint on how you can sort of hire good quality engineers really quickly. The reality was it was actually really difficult. We had a lot of failures. We iterated, we changed and tried a few different things. But what that actually helped me and the people I was working with at the time realize was that hiring isn't just this thing that you set and forget. It isn't just this process you grab off the shelf and you just fire through and you get some engineers and everything's good. It's this thing that you kind of have to really think about. You have to invest some time in it. You have to look at what you're doing, why you're doing it, the methods that you're using, the tools that you use. And there's a lot of opportunity to actually get that wrong. And the reason that that can be really problematic is that getting a bad hire into your organization is a really, really painful thing to correct. At Seek, and it's reasonably common in Australia, we don't have probation periods. So once you have a job with the company, you're in, that's it. So getting that wrong can actually cause you a lot of damage if you find out that the person isn't a good culture fit or they don't have the skills that they advertised. So this isn't intended to be any sort of paint by numbers approach. What I thought I'd do is I'd actually go through and sort of talk about the things that we realized that are important to think about. Every organization is kind of different, every hiring need's kind of different, but there's probably a bunch of things that are reasonably consistent that you should be thinking about. And I've got a few example demos. I wouldn't say look at these as demos you should absolutely replicate. This is probably things that we've done at a point in time, and we've probably changed and moved on a bit since then. So when I was trying to think about how to give this talk, it's actually a reasonably complicated thing to do. Hiring is quite a broad subject. It's got a lot of different aspects. When I was sitting trying to work out what to say and how to say it, you could really go deep on lots of these different areas, and you could probably spend an hour on each if you wanted to. So I decided I really wanted to get the end-to-end process of hiring and the things that we consider in that space, and then also get a certain level of depth that hopefully will be useful to you. So if I don't go deep enough and there's things that you would like to talk about, I'm more than happy to hang around at the end. My email address will be up at the end as well, so if you want to shoot some questions, that's fine. But I've tried to do it in a way where we can get through a reasonable amount, hopefully provide some helpful info, and leave some space for questions. So, first thing I'm going to talk about is a specification. So, do you all use job specs when you're hiring? Is that common? Yeah, generally nods. Okay, cool. I don't know if you're like me, but when I first started hiring, the approach I took to job specs was, great, I've got to hire a senior engineer. Can somebody just get me the senior engineer job spec off the internet? I'll have a quick cursory glance over it. That seems about right. That line seems a bit insane. I'll take that out and I'll add this one in. And that was the spec that I would use. And I did that for years. That was just basically, I grabbed it and I used it. It took me a really long time to realize that's a really, really dumb thing to do. When you're hiring somebody into an organization, you're effectively making an investment. You're making an investment with the company's money and the company's time. And you should probably spend a little bit more time than just grabbing something off of a folder share somewhere and making a quick modification to it. So the way I try and approach it now is every time you're making a hire, it's an opportunity to examine what is it you actually need. And if you can't do that, if you can't articulate what you actually need, it might mean that you don't actually need what you think you do. So it's really worth spending a little bit of time on this part to make sure you can clearly articulate what you need to hire and why you need to hire it. An anti-pattern I've seen in this space is where somebody leaves a team and the immediate knee-jerk reaction is just to hire another person that looks just like that person, has a similar profile to them. And you might be missing an opportunity there where there's another engineer in the team that's ready to step up and act more in that capacity. And then you might have another opportunity taking a more junior engineer, and there might be mentoring or coaching opportunities there. So if you don't think about it, you will just end off keeping the team in a very stagnant state. One thing that I find quite interesting to do is if I'm working with engineering managers that can't clearly articulate what they're trying to hire, I advise them not to hire. I just say, right now, just put a pause in it until you can get your ideas around what it is you need to hire. And I encourage them to hire when it hurts, effectively. It's much easier to articulate what will make your life better when something's making your life bad. So if you aren't certain and you can't clearly articulate, just hold off, don't hire. Wait until you are seeing the pain or feeling the pain and you can see what's needed in the team. And that will give you a much better view on what it is you actually need. Effectively, if you need the role, you should be able to describe it. It's probably an early warning signal that you might not be setting off on the best foot. And what I've found is not getting this part right can actually have a compounding negative effect throughout the rest of the process. If you think about not being able to specify what you want, how do you advertise for something specifically? How do you create testing conditions for something? So really, I can't emphasize enough that this part is a really important part to focus on. The thing that I always like to start with is what the role needs to be accountable for. It's something I don't often see in a lot of job descriptions. To be perfectly honest, a lot of job descriptions that I see other people doing are usually just flashy job ads. It's like, come work in an amazing team, be an awesome collaborator and a communicator. It doesn't actually say what you're supposed to be doing in the job. It doesn't say what you're accountable for. So I always encourage people that are writing job descriptions to kind of sit and think, well, if you were to reflect on this role 6 months from now and you were to say it's successful, what's your definition? How do you define that? How do you tell what that is? It's quite a difficult thing to do, but I've kind of started using a technique with a bunch of people that are doing hiring that seems to be working reasonably well. And I just call it things would be awesome if. It's a good way of sort of fleshing out what some of the core accountabilities of a role might be. So I've just put a quick example up. Things would be awesome if our team built cloud-first products that were in line with organizational strategy. Our platform was healthy and recovered quickly from failure. Our teams are able to continuously deploy to production and get fast feedback from our customers. Our junior engineers have someone they can learn from working in the team. I mean, I've just picked some random things there, but if you say those things are true, if all that's true, then things would be pretty awesome. We'd be happy with that. So if that's the case, you can then say, therefore, we need someone who will build cloud-native applications in line with organizational strategy, keep the platform healthy and resilient. It's pretty simple. You literally say, what are the true conditions that you want? And then what does making that true look like? And put that accountability around about a role. You're basically saying, this is what this job needs to do. And you've now got a measurable way of telling whether it's been done well or not. So once you've got your accountabilities, once you're able to think about that, you can then start to think about, right, well, if I know what this job has to be accountable for, what kind of experience do I need? You know, if I know somebody has to be able to build cloud applications, a negative pattern you see here all the time is needs 5 years experience. I'm not even sure what that means. I've seen people that just do the same job for 5 years, and they are no more experienced than an amazing grad that comes in and can do a much better job in 6 months. So you really have to think about experience, and I always encourage people to think about experience in terms of outcomes. You know, what are the outcomes that somebody has done that gives them, or that allows them to say that they have this experience? So some examples of experience that I've got here. You know, we'd be looking for somebody who has experience leading a software engineering team and improving overall software delivery performance. We'd be looking for somebody who has experience architecting, building, and operating highly scalable, available, performant, and secure applications. You can kind of be quite specific about the experience that you want and the type of person that you want. And again, if you remove the subjectivity from the things that you're saying, it's all testable. And hopefully what you'll see here is you're actually starting to build up a specification that not only outlines what the actual role is, it's actually testable. And it means that you can use it in subsequent steps in your process to test whether the candidates that you're interviewing are going to be a good match for the role that you need. After you've done experience, you can then think about, well, what type of skills would be required for this role? I mean, all this sounds super basic, right? None of this is rocket science. It's all pretty obvious when you see it on the screen. But what I find quite amazing is that people just don't do this. What are the skills that are required? Like literally, what are the technical skills that might be required to perform this role? Do we need a C# developer, a TypeScript developer? Do we need, for personal, do they need leadership skills? Do they need change management skills? Do they need coaching and mentoring skills? You can actually list out what they are. The way I tend to do it is I tend to say these are the skills that are absolutely necessary, and these are the ones that would be great if the individual had. So if you break the specification down into those three things, effectively what you're saying is, what are the accountabilities of the role? What is the experience required? And what are the skills that are needed to be successful in those roles? And I think that basically makes the bones of what would be a fairly effective specification. So I'm actually going to try and bounce out. I'm going to do a live demo with Word. Never seen that before. If I can get out of this. So I'm just going to show you an example of a job description that I tend to use. So that's 9. And there. Here. So This is a job description for principal engineer. So this is what I'd call a template position description. So where you see the braces means that that's to be filled in by the team who are looking for somebody. But this is a typical job description that we use. So principal engineer, the company and location. So because of the way Seek operates, it still uses the names of the companies that they originally acquired. So Job Street is based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The role, we usually just have a bit of a blurb about the role, just the sort of one-liner to say this is what it actually is. We then have some parts that are kind of the logistics, the explicits about the role. So you are reporting to, and usually that's explicitly who that individual actually is. You're responsible for, if you have any direct reports, you might not. Usually that line comes out if you don't. Your key stakeholders will include, in this case, the engineering manager, product manager, architecture team. That's usually the basics. But if we scroll down, what we're actually doing here is we're baking into the job description what the key responsibilities actually include. And this is what we use in our principal developer role. So what we're saying is contributing to the overall strategy and making sure things are aligned, ensuring systems are well architected and follow current Seek development practices. We have a whole bunch of internal practices that we prefer people to use. Maintaining platform health and making sure things are secure and reliant, keeping customer focused. That's a big part of what we try and encourage our engineers to do, is make sure that we're constantly thinking about our customers. Creating a high-performing team. So the principal role is a leadership role. There's expectations around about that. And growing personal and technical capabilities through coaching and mentoring. So what we're effectively saying is if all these things are happening, you're doing a good job. Like, it's something we can actually measure. We can say that if this is true, everything's going pretty well. We then go down to a little bit about the team. So like I say, if there's a specific team that they work for, we fill in the details there. And then we go down into essential experience, skills, and competencies. And again, this is just how I talked about it. Experience are those 3 items. That's what we say, the experience that we expect for somebody in this role. And we will test that in the interview. These are the personal skills. So for this one, because it's a leadership role, we sort of load the first 4. Yeah, the first 4 skills are technically what you would call leadership skills. So being able to identify opportunity and risk, focus on outcome, influencing and motivating others. And then when we go down at the technical skills, now this is the one I get the most sort of feedback about. I find that engineering managers really don't like this. I don't actually go into specifics of what actual technologies. I don't say they have to be able to write C# or this, that, or the other. What I do say is that they can create continuous delivery pipelines. They can create cloud-native software. We outline a bunch of things, but what I'm trying to focus on here is talk about the outcomes, what we expect from the role, and kind of leave the mechanics of how they do that to them as an individual. What we then can go down to is the things that we find desirable, and that's where we can be a bit more specific. So, it's desirable if you create software in one of the following languages: C#, TypeScript, JavaScript, Go, Scala, Swift, Kotlin. That's the languages we primarily use at Seek. So yeah. This is what I like to do. Other teams use something called a hiring profile, which is a slimmed down version of this. It doesn't really have any of the stuff about the team or who you report to, but I find that this is actually a really useful artifact to create. If done well, again, like me, you probably find that does everyone here know what their own job description looks like? Okay, there's some nods. That's good. For me, my job description was always the document I got the day I started that went in a drawer and I didn't look at until the day I left. So I think that's a really poor way to do it, and I think that having a document like this can act as a blueprint, and it's something that you can look to for your development needs. It's something you can look to for your performance assessments. I think it's a good artifact just to have with engineers. So if you start with it in the hiring process and create it well, it's something that the engineer can keep throughout the career in your organization. Okay, I'm going to try and get back to the deck. Did that work? Cool. Okay, so I think I've already covered. Oh no, actually, sorry, I haven't. So specification can be used, obviously, to define the role. What can then happen is, for the following stages that come after that, you can actually then design an interview process that specifically tests the things that you've said that need to be true for this role to be successful. So instead of just having a generic process where you arbitrarily just get them to do some things and everyone does the same thing, you can kind of tailor your recruitment process to the specific roles. And that's something we found to be really effective, is that when we started moving into a more tailored interviewing process for different types of engineers, we're finding that we're getting more out of the engineers. The engineers are engaging, they're enjoying it more, and when that tends to happen, they tend to perform better in the interview situation. So I'd say previously, when we had a very blanket approach to hiring, we had common problems and we had just applied that to everyone, there was probably a really good chance that we were disengaging genuinely good engineers that just weren't really grabbed by the problem that we were putting in front of them, and we weren't seeing the best, and then they weren't being successful in our hiring process. So that was really a fault of ours. What's great about the specification as well is when the candidate is a candidate and they're a prospective candidate, you can give it to them as part of the hiring process, and they've got absolute clarity about the role, what they're coming to. So kind of feel like I've labored specification enough. But that's the first thing that I tend to think about, is how well understood and defined is this role that we're going to be hiring. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is sourcing. And that was actually something that I noticed being quite different country to country. The different approaches that organizations take to sourcing, especially between the UK, Australia, and Malaysia, is quite vast. So sourcing, I tend to break down into 3 primary areas. The first one being advertising online. I'm not going to talk about that too much. I mean, I'm sure everyone here has probably posted a job ad online. There's lots of options. You can either go for a paid service or a free service. So a paid service, you post your job ad, it usually stays there for about 4 or 5 weeks. A free service, there's a whole bunch of aggregators like Indeed and Google for Jobs now that if you post it on your website, they will scrape it up and it'll be part of their search results. You get generalist websites that will post jobs for everything from a doctor to a nurse to a pharmacist to a software developer. That's what Seek is. We operate in a generalized area. Or you get specialist websites that are specifically for targeting software engineers. So GitHub Jobs, Stack Overflow, things like that. I can't actually offer a lot of opinion in this area because at Seek we kind of have this internal policy of eating our own dog food, and we're not really meant to use other job platforms. So if we find that our platform isn't good enough, we have to find ways to make it better. So it means I don't actually get to play around with things like Google for Jobs or Stack Overflow. So if anyone here has experience in that and would like to share it towards the end, I'd love to hear a bit about that because I am quite curious how well those platforms work. The thing about advertising online is that you are targeting active job seekers, so people are looking for a job. So that means that there's a really good chance that you could probably convert that into a hire. But the downside of that also means that they tend to be applying for lots of jobs. So you get people that are actively engaged, want to move to a new company, but they've probably sent out 4 or 5 different applications, which means your chances of landing them narrows a little bit. What I found as well with advertising online is you tend to get a large amount of applications. So for any role that we advertise online, we tend to get, and for a single engineering job in Australia, it was 200 to 300 applications. In Malaysia, it's around about the 200 mark as well. So that's a lot of applications you've got to review. You've got to look through them all, and that can have an impact on the people that are doing the screening and the level of effort that you want to go to. So it's just something to bear in mind. You tend to get a lot. It's more quantity over quality, I would say. But one thing I've actually found to be true is it doesn't matter. What really matters when you're advertising online and what will make the difference between having good candidates and the pool of people that apply and bad candidates is the quality of job ad you write. Again, it sounds super obvious, but if you write a terrible job ad, I can almost guarantee you'll only get terrible applications, people that you probably wouldn't want to hire. If you write a really good job ad, you'll still get a lot of applications from terrible candidates you wouldn't want to hire, but you will get some candidates that you would want to hire. Again, I'll show you a quick demo of of the difference. So I'm going to start with a bad one first. Let's see if we can see this. So this is one that I just pulled off of JobStreet in Malaysia. And okay, it is for PHP, but take that out of the equation. You can swap that with any language. If you read the job ad, I mean, how excited are you about joining this company? It's pretty terrible. It doesn't really say what the job's about. At the start, it says, do you have 3 years experience in web 3 years of experience in web development? If yes, you qualify. Great. So that's a company that's super thorough about how they interview and check staff. There's nothing in that would cause me to press click to apply for that job. If we compare that with somebody who who I think is doing really well in this space at the moment. I think everyone knows who Atlassian are here. Yeah, they're pretty big deal. If you look at this one, this is a much better job ad, right? There's a lot of different elements to it. If you look at, well, actually, what I'll do is I've got a slide that talks about it. But if you look at what it's got, it's effectively, it's got a compelling job title. It's not just a senior software engineer. It talks a little bit about the team. Most good job ads tend to start with a bit of an emotional hook, something that will get you bought in and wanting to read more. So love staying ahead of the growth curve and experimenting with new software and environments. Get on board as a senior software developer on the Atlassian personalization platform team. That's something that people do when they reflect and say, yeah, I do love staying ahead of the growth curve. That's me. I identify with that. So it'll actually pull them in and cause them to read more. So Atlassian do great job ads. There's a lot of companies that do really good ones. The main structure that I tend to recommend around about this, if I can get this back up, is, where are we? Yeah, so I'll just put these all up at once. Basically, this is the recommendation I give to people who are writing job ads. Use an interesting job title. If people are browsing through an online platform, they're going to see the same job titles over and over, so you want something that's going to be a bit of a hook. Create an immediate emotional connection. Try and appeal to their sort of base level interests. What is the sort of thing they want to do? Talk a bit about your company's story. Most people want to understand a bit about the company they're joining and the purpose and the mission that they're on. Talk about why the role is needed and why this person, and this just helps build a story or build a picture for a person who might be applying to your role. Sell the opportunities to come with it. If you join us and you spend 2 years in this company, these are the things that you're going to get out of it instead of joining somebody else, and talk about the benefits. The reason I say repeat why they should apply at the bottom is if you look at a lot of job boards, the apply button's actually at the bottom. So you just have another bit at the bottom just to reinforce why they should apply, and it really encourages them to hit that button at the bottom. So that's online advertising. Now this is the one that I probably use the most. Engaging researchers. So by researchers, I mean that can either be an agency or an internal researcher if your company has the funds. I haven't actually been in the UK for a very long time. Are agencies a big thing here? Yeah, they are. Okay, cool. When I worked in Scotland, they were almost non-existent. So when I moved to Australia, it was really weird that as soon as I put my LinkedIn profile, I was in Australia, I was getting all these phone calls from random strangers. Yeah, so engaging agencies, you can either go with an agency that you want to partner with, or if, like I say, your organization has the budget, you can have an internal research team. What I would say about agencies, or what I've learned about agencies, is it's a bit like finding a good hairdresser. Once you find one, never let them go. It doesn't matter what company or agency they move to, stay with the same person. They will get to know you and what you're looking for in hires. So, take that time to build a relationship. It's like anything, like car salesmen or like real estate agents. There's a lot of shoddy ones out there that all they really want to do is push an agent and get you, push a candidate and get you assigned as quickly as possible. So it's worth spending the time to invest to make sure they understand what you're looking for. Now, using agencies, why I do like to use researchers is you're actually you're usually targeting passive job seekers. You're targeting people who aren't actively in the market looking, which usually means, in my experience at least, that they're probably quite good. Companies tend to look after really good engineers, so that really good engineers don't tend to be outwardly looking. It also means that if an agency or a researcher finds this individual and convinces them to come interview with you, the chances are you might be the only organization they're actually interviewing with, so it increases your chances of converting the hire. What I like about agencies as well is I'll always say to the agencies I work with, I would far rather have 3 super high value or super high quality resumes rather than 10. So you can sort of stipulate that you really want to focus on quality over quantity. And you can actually be really specific with agencies around things that you want to do in terms of improving diversity of source. So if you want to think a bit about the gender balance in your team, a challenge I have in Malaysia at the moment, believe it or not, is hiring Malaysian developers. It's ridiculously hard. There's not a lot of them. So I really want there to be good representation of Malaysians in the engineering teams, and I'm finding that really difficult. So I'm having to engage an agency and say, can you please look for Malaysian developers? And what the agency is helping me with is they're able to go look at places like Singapore. There's a lot of Malaysians go to Singapore because there's higher wages. But as their parents get older, it's quite common for them to come back and look after their parents. So I've got an agency that's actually in Singapore looking for engineers that fit that profile. Or we have a lot of Malaysians that have gone to Australia to get an education and just ended off staying. And again, their parents are on the phone saying, you need to come back. So we've got agencies specifically looking for that because that's the sort of type of profile that we want to hire. Yeah, can search overseas. So I guess what I would say is when you're using a research agent, it would probably give you access to engineers that would ordinarily be invisible to you. So I hear a lot of people saying, and when I first moved to Malaysia, that was something I was told a lot. You won't find good quality engineers here. There just aren't any. And then my first question was like, okay, great. How are we advertising? What agencies are we using? And I got a blank stare. It was like, what do you mean agencies? It's like, well, do we have anyone actually out in market hunting for us? And they were like, oh, no, we tried that. It didn't really work. I said, right. So I got a couple of agencies in. I briefed them. They understood what we were looking for. They went out. They had a couple of misfires. Some dodgy resumes came, but we tuned and we changed. And yeah, we ended up successfully hiring 3 really great engineering managers. And I guess my point to people who say that that you can't find these candidates is, are you sure you're looking in the right way? Are you sure you're using all the tools that are available to you? The one downside about agencies is they can be pretty expensive. I don't know what the rates are here, but in Malaysia, it's typically 15 to 20% of an annual salary, which isn't a small amount of money. But when you think about the amount of time that you can, if you're searching through a large amount of candidates and you've got all your engineers doing interviews, that actually adds up quite quickly. So I'd say you have to balance out and work out if that makes sense for you. The last thing about sourcing is internal referrals. This is something that I find almost consistently companies don't do particularly well. One thing that I find to be true is good engineers tend to know good engineers. I know I have one friend who works at a company who their talent acquisition department actually sit their engineers down and get them to open up their LinkedIn page in front of them and go through their network and say, who out of your friends would you recommend for an engineering job here? I mean, that's a pretty extreme approach, and I don't think I'd be pretty comfortable doing that myself, but I think this company's tacked onto the fact pretty quickly that good engineers tend to know good engineers. The reason that I've found referral programs don't tend to happen all that much is because they tend to be this thing that somebody set up and then it just goes on an intranet page somewhere and it's never talked about again. There's never any active engagement with the engineers to say, hey, did you realize we've got a referral program? These are the benefits. This is what you can do. So there tends to be a lack of knowledge about it. And also the incentives seem to be terrible. You are willing to pay an agency 15 to 20% to bring somebody into the company, but you're only going to pay one of your own employees $1,000. That doesn't quite seem right. So for a lot of engineers, they don't really think that it's worth the money. They're concerned about the recruitment process. I know personally, there's been companies that I've worked at where, I've known great engineers. I'd love to have them come join us, but frankly, I've been pretty embarrassed by the way that we hire, and I've got low confidence that they would get through our hiring process. It's not because they were bad engineers, it's because we were bad at hiring. So, there's a lot of worry about how that recruitment process can reflect on the engineer that makes the referral. So the chances are your engineers know plenty of existing or other great engineers. You just have to have the correct incentive system and make sure they have all the information available to them. There are some other options. I can't really talk about them because I haven't done them much. I have been to meetups. People have stood up there and said, we're hiring. I don't know how successful that actually is. Conferences and events, I just asked, but apparently everyone in this room is hiring, but nobody seems to be talking to engineers to convince them to come to their organization. Do you get HackerX? Is that a thing here? Yeah, there's certain events that you get invites to, and it's kind of like a weird engineering speed dating situation where you set up your stall, and we're company X, and you get like 3 minutes with each engineer, and they just move on, and you collect names. I tried one, it was as awkward as speed dating, so I wouldn't recommend that personally. And then if you actually have a hunt around, if you check on various forums, you'll find that there's a whole bunch of private, and some of them public Slack groups. There's an excellent engineering manager Slack group called RANS, I think. It's the guy who runs Slack. It's the guy who runs Slack. He has a private group that you can just basically apply to get into if you're an engineering manager. And they've just got volumes of channels, hirings in there. They've got loads of advice. So you can have a hunt around. So that's sourcing. The next part I want to talk about is selection. So if you can't tell, the stages I think about, they all start with an S. It's an easy way for me to remember it. One thing that I talk to people about all the time is that bringing somebody into your organization is actually one of the most impactful decisions you can make. You're effectively scaling yourself when you do it. You're finding somebody that can help you work. Sorry, there's a really bad creak there. You have to appropriately invest in a good selection process that will give you objective data and help you make good decisions. So effectively, all hiring is about decision making. You can make a good hire or a bad hire. It's effectively a good decision or a bad decision. I'm sure most of you are probably aware that you make better decisions when you've got better data. So you should probably invest your time making sure you've got a recruitment process that gives you good data. If you get shit data, then you're going to probably have, well, you might luck out, but you're probably going to eventually have crap outcomes in your hiring. So these are the areas I tend to focus on. Make sure you're designing a process that tests the criteria of the role. That's why doing the specification right at the start is so important. If you've got a good criteria, you can then create a process that specifically tests that criteria. Creating and training a dedicated hiring squad is something that I only started doing at Seek, but it's actually proving to be pretty awesome. Previously, we had distributed hiring where we had around about 20 software engineering teams, and they were all kind of responsible for their own hiring. They'd post their own ads, they'd do their own interviewing. We had all these horrible situations where we'd find out hiring was grossly inconsistent, and we'd have a candidate who wasn't good for Team A, but turned out he would have been great for Team B, just Team B didn't know he existed. So we had all these horrible inefficiencies by doing things in a distributed manner. We've created a centralized hiring squad now where we've basically said we're going to hire as a company. We're not going to hire as individual teams. And we would like people to join from each of the teams and be a representative part of that hiring squad. There was a bit of debate whether we pick which engineers, these are the engineers we think would be good at, or whether we sort of open it up to everyone. And in the end, we opened it up to everyone. And what I was amazed with was it's a really great way to find out who all the leaders are in your organization. The people who put their hand up and say, hey, I care about who works here. I care about what we achieve. I want to be a part of making sure that that's a good outcome. Creating a hiring squad is a great way to do that. It also means you've got, every time I've done it, at least every time I've done it, you actually get a fairly diverse hiring squad as well. There's an equal balance of thought, tenure, gender. Gender, maybe not so much, it's harder to get that, but it's a good way of making sure you've got a balanced representation of the organization that are working on the hiring process. You need to make sure you're collecting data in a consistent way. That was one of the hardest things that made us really inefficient all those years ago was we would collect all this data and it would just be reams and reams of subjective notes. It'd go from pros, cons, what they did well, what they didn't. And when you're trying to make a hiring decision and distilling all that information to work out, did this person do well in the hiring process? That's a really hard thing to do. So make sure that you're collecting data in a consistent way. I've got an example of how you can do that in a minute. And then in the end, make sure that you're making informed hiring decisions. You'll find you're in this interesting spot, or I did at least anyway, when you follow this robust process, you've got a well-designed specification, you are hiring in a way that tests that specification, you're collecting data in a consistent way, and then at the end, you'll get an outcome. You'll look at the results and say, oh, I wouldn't have thought that. I wouldn't have thought that that person would have had those strengths or that person would be suitable for that role. And that's your internal stereotyping and bias system doing what it would do if that wasn't there to tell it that this person actually probably can be a great engineer. So it was very uncomfortable to start with. There was a few hires I was kind of really uneasy about, but then we put our trust in the system that we've developed, and those engineers have turned out to be absolutely amazing. So it's a really good way of making good decisions or better decisions because you've got better data. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. Like I said earlier, we've iterated, we've tried a lot of different things. We kind of have this sort of multi-dimensional, if this condition is true, we do this step. I'm not going to go into that because that would just be confusing. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give an example. I'll just put it all up at once. An example of what a simple hiring process that we might do would look like. So stage one, we basically do resume screening. So that's if we do an online campaign. We get a lot of resumes, so we screen those actual resumes to make sure there's no duplication, there's no people. I mean, when you advertise for software engineers, you will get bus drivers applying, looking for their next bus driving job. I don't know how that happens, but it does. Something that we also do as well, we really wanted to focus on candidate experience when we were designing our hiring processes and making sure that it was an enjoyable experience for the candidate regardless of the outcome. So something that we put a lot of effort into is we actually telephone screen absolutely everyone that could reasonably work with us. And all we're looking for there is, can this individual articulate some basic things? Can they communicate? What we're really trying to avoid is getting into an interview situation where, I don't know if you've ever had this, but candidate sits down, you've got an hour and a half to interview them, you ask them a question, you get a one-word answer. You're like, oh, this is going to take a while. So we're really trying to avoid those types of situations and really making an initial connection. Once stage one's out of the way, what we actually then say is stage two, which can look a bit like this. We're going to put all candidates through every single stage. Not one of these single stages is a pass-fail, because they each test different things and will demonstrate different strengths and capabilities of that candidate. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. For the coding challenge, we do something that a lot of companies do. We do a standardized, or our own standardized online test. I've had quite a lot of feedback about this. Not a lot of people like this. Once I explain how we do it, it's maybe a little bit less scary, but effectively I create 4 questions, and the first question is super simple. Just think of it as a light stretch. It's basically a function takes in 2 numbers and does something, and you're just basically getting ready to start coding, and then the questions just get progressively harder one after the other. And what we say to candidates is, this is not a pass-fail. You don't have to complete the whole thing. Spend 2 hours, see how far you get, and we'll just take it from there. So don't overinvest your time. Some candidates still do. We've had to start capping it at 4 because some of them will spend forever on it. But really all we're looking for there is, can this individual actually code? Can they, do they understand basic data structures? Do they understand algorithms? Do they understand complexity? Sometimes if a candidate looks great on resume or telephone screen and they absolutely tank, we give them the benefit of doubt. We assume that you don't do these types of tests in your day-to-day job. So if they come in with a low score, we get back in touch and say, hey, didn't look that great. Would you want to take a second test? And we have a second test which is almost the same. Well, sorry, it's the same structure but different questions. And we usually find that once they've kind of got over the nerves of doing the one and they understand how it works a little bit better, they do significantly better in the second stage or the second attempt. So we don't use that as a way of filtering out people. It's just to understand that they can code. The second part is a technical collaboration. I feel this part's really important because what we're trying to do is replicate how this individual will work with you in the workplace. So what we have is we have a bunch of solutions that have a front-end component, a back-end component, usually some sort of process worker. There'll be infrastructure as code things in there, and it's just riddled with bugs. And whatever type of engineer is coming in, we'll schedule them to come in with one of our engineers, and they'll sit and do a pairing exercise to fix the bugs. And they'll usually sit down and they'll work it out together. And usually the way it works is, if you fix one bug, then it works, but you've actually created another bug, and you've got to kind of follow the chain. Something we're experimenting with at the moment is we're actually getting a third person in this pairing to do the assessment, because we're finding it's hard for people to do a pairing and assess at the same time. So when they pair with an engineer, they're so focused on the problem that they're trying to solve, they're not actually paying attention to how the engineer is solving the problem. So we're trying that, and that's taking a bit of explanation to sort of say why there's this quiet person sitting in the corner of the room taking notes, but that's what we're trying at the moment. And then the third part is just a cultural fit or add, or however you want to put that. If you've got a really good culture and you want to make sure that that grows, then it might be a fit. If you have an idea of what type of culture you want to create, then we have an hour interview for culture add and making sure that they align with that. The third stage is basically, once we have all that data, we know what they look like on paper, we've got a sense of how they communicate and what they sound like on the phone, we know that they can code, we understand that they can collaborate well with our engineers, we think that they'd either be a great culture fit or add. We then look for opportunities to which teams or individuals as a line manager they might match with, and if that works out well, we go to offer, and if it doesn't, we don't. Something I talk to people all the time about is it's perfectly okay not to hire an engineer who works really well, or looks really good, if there's not a really good match for them in the organization. We can just be upfront and honest and say, we love you as an engineer, we think you're great, there's just not a strong match for you in the organization right now, and we want to make sure that you'd be set up for success. The third part, whether they're successful or not, we always give them back feedback. So we'll say, if you go through this process, these are the parts that you did well, these are the parts we think that you might want to spend some time training on, and what we always do is encourage them to come back and interview with us again. So that's been a pretty important part of it too. So yeah, sorry. what we're really saying there is stage one kind of deduplicates obvious mismatches. We're testing capabilities. So everything we do in that stage is kind of a way of measuring what's in the criteria or specification. And then we determine and deliver the outcome to the individual. So like I say, that was an example of a thing you can do. There's variations and permutations of that. If you are unsure what to do, or you're doing something a bit less basic than that, or a bit more basic than that, you can probably look at doing that. The third part I want to talk about in terms of selection is creating and training your hiring squad. So I mentioned earlier that if you put out a message to say that we have this mission, we're trying to do this great thing, you'll probably find that the people in your organization that care the most about that will respond and want to be a part of hiring. We talked a bit about centralized versus distributed. I believe that centralized hiring is the only way to achieve overall hiring consistency in your organization. If you do it distributed, it's much harder to keep an eye on and make sure that it's actually working really well. One thing we found is you have to be super clear about the commitment required on the engineers at the start of the process. Something that we failed on when we first did this was we didn't really calculate the amount of candidates that we had, the amount of people in the hiring pool, and then what their time requirement would be to process that in a month. And it turned out they were hiring all day, every day, and their managers were getting really angry, and their product managers were wondering why nothing was moving. So work out how many people you need to make sure that their time commitment isn't too large, and then be clear about the commitment and make sure they've communicated that with their line managers. When you've got multiple stages, we find it's more productive to let them self-select. Some people will just happily blast through 20 resumes and screen that. Other people want to be in culture interviews. Let them self-select, and at that, people tend to gravitate towards the things that they're best at. Make sure you're training them appropriately. So for everyone that's on a hiring squad, we run internal bias management training. We try and make them more aware of their internal biases. We run structured interview training, basically, which goes through the sort of questions you can ask, the sort of questions you can't. For instance, it's super not good to ask a female engineer if she's planning on having a baby anytime soon. Turns out it's super illegal, you shouldn't do that. So a lot of people just don't know the basics of that sort of stuff. So we have some training in that space as well. And then make sure that you have some sort of program to reward or recognize them. So we have people that are identified as a hiring squad. There's shout outs to the achievements that they're making. Personally, I'd like to start looking at how we can remunerate them in an improved way and make sure that it's coming up in their annual performance reviews. And then the last part about selection is collecting data. I think I mentioned it earlier, but the best way to do this is use repeatable and consistent data capture and scoring methods. I'll show an example of how we've done that in the past. When you do that, create guides for the people that are going to be on the squad. It's great to have examples of what a good answer looks like, what a bad answer looks like. And if that's done well, then people can very quickly sort of work out whether this candidate's a good candidate or a bad candidate, score them appropriately. Something that's really important as well is when you book people in for an interview, when you're hiring squad, you're saying you're interviewing this person for an hour, always book in a half hour afterwards for just them. Give them time to sort of collect their notes and their thoughts and make sure they've got all the information down. Because if you only give them an hour and they have to go back to their day job and they've got a pressing deadline that they have to work on, I guarantee you they will forget all the stuff that they interviewed or all the things that they thought when they were interviewing. So give them that half hour slot afterwards to process the information. And then, actually, what I'll do is I'll quickly show the form. So again, this is just an example. So this was for an engineering manager role. This is a form that we use, and we basically outlay some of the key things you have to do. Introduce yourself, make sure that you clarify what the role is, check that they've seen the job description. There's core areas that we want to cover. We're not digging into their sort of capability too much. We're just spending 10 minutes having a conversation to make sure they're roughly ballpark. This rating score doesn't work particularly well. 1 weak, 3 strong, 2 anything in between. We're now moving to a model where we use like a Likert scale, and we'll actually say this candidate was able to demonstrate good architectural development practices. I strongly agree, disagree. We find that that's a much easier way to sort of get people to score where they think candidates sit. But yeah, basically you have forms like this, and what this means is that when you get to the end of your process, you can actually go in and see all the information that was collected about the candidate, and you can make a decision based on that. And what's great is you can then, at a later point in time, somebody who's new is joining the organization, who might be taking on somebody in a line manager, can go back and look at all the material that was collected during their interview process to sort of see what was identified. Right, almost there. So, like I said, if you're doing it right, you're going to be able to make better decisions based on data. You're able to work out the strength and development areas of a candidate. Now that's great. If the candidate's successful, you've almost got their career development plan started for when they join the organization. You know where the areas they have to work on and where they need development. If the candidate's unsuccessful, it's also great because they really value that feedback. I don't know about you, but for the amount of jobs that I applied for when I was a lot younger and didn't getting stonewalled by the company with no real reasonable feedback is a horrible feeling. You can't tell whether you didn't perform well or you don't know what's going on. So we always, to try and maintain that candidate experience, we always make sure that we give them good, meaningful feedback. Again, we look at possible teams, offer regret feedback. So that's specification, sourcing, and selecting. And that's generally the bulk of it. There's just one part at the end, which I guess technically isn't hiring, but I think it's worth mentioning because I can't think where else it would be mentioned. But that is how do you've hired somebody, you've negotiated a salary, they've got a start date, how are you setting them up for success when you join the organization? And again, this is something that people really often overlook. I don't think there's any excuse to not get the basics right. If you have somebody joining your organization, they need to have a desk, they need to have a laptop, they need to have an account, they need to have access to Jenkins or whatever it is, you know, that should all be on day one. Like, you shouldn't ever have anyone joining sitting around feeling like they're a spare part because you didn't do the work up front to make sure that they joined the organization. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to a whole bunch of people, but I don't think there's much of an excuse for it these days. I go through a process with every new hire that joins the teams to explain the product, the platform, the people, and the process. Again, I like to stick to S's and P's because it just helps me remember things, but all I'm really talking about there is you give them an overview of the products, the product suite that we build, the area that they work in. The platform is the technology, the architecture. The people is, you know, all the forums, who they report to, what their peer groups are. And then the process is usually around about how we deliver. So the agile practices the organization adheres to. We run OKRs. I'm not sure if that's a huge thing here or not, but you know, we introduce them and give them training on that. I also like to make sure that we create a 30, 60, and 90-day plan. I think it's good to have that structure right at the start, so you can alleviate a lot of stress on a new hire. We're saying for the first 30 days, all we really want you to do is learn. Just sit down, observe, do some pairing, work out how things work. We'll have a check-in at the end of the month, and we'll see what you're learning and whether it's working out. And you can sort of stage that to say, at this point, we'll be expecting X, at that point, we'll be expecting Y. And that can really help the engineers that are joining your organization be clear on what's needed from them. Introducing them to their peer group is always a really useful exercise. So if you're hiring a principal or a senior, introduce them to all the other seniors in the organization. Something we started doing when we have a new hire start is they will start in Team X, but we will have them rotate through Team A, B, C, D for the first 2 weeks. And the sole purpose of that exercise is so they can meet other engineers that would otherwise take them months to meet if they were just sitting in their own individual team. So we found that that's a really good mechanism to do that. Also, finding them a buddy outside their reporting line. This was something that actually came through from the grad program. Buddies was something that we did for the grads to make sure they always had somebody that they could talk to outside of the reporting line. But it turned out just to be super useful for general engineers. We find that engineers have this really, or I do this, and you have this uncomfortable period where you feel like you should know what something is, and you feel like you missed that point of asking the question of what this thing is without looking stupid. So having a buddy outside that you can just check in, hey, what does that KMI thing mean, you know, is probably a useful thing as well. Have frequent check-ins and one-to-ones. Like I say, none of this is rocket science. It's all good hygiene, but again, unless you explicitly have a plan in place to do these sorts of things, they tend to not be done frequently. And the most important thing is if you are designing a hiring process and an onboarding process, collect feedback. You know, the person who just went through your hiring process is the best person to tell you where it's not working or where it's hard or where you can improve it. So get that feedback right at the start. I try and encourage people to think about an onboarding process a bit like a product. So, you know, it's something you can iterate, it's something you can change. So yeah, I'd always recommend that. So that's the 4 key areas. Just want to quickly cover the results. The result I'm most proud of actually is candidates who aren't successful getting back to us and saying how thankful they are for the feedback that we've given them. That's actually been one of the great things that have come out of this, and we find that we're having repeat applicants, which is great. We found that, we mentioned we had to hire those 25 engineers in the 2-month period. We actually managed to hire 20. We didn't get the 25, but 80% is pretty good. And we managed to do it in a way that the engineers that we hired are all, at the very least, meeting, and in many cases, exceeding the performance requirements. So we didn't actually, we didn't drop on quality. We just ran, we've now got centralized with operational support, and we've just run a successful test in Asia of the same approach to hiring, which went really, really well. So we're now looking at rolling out across all of engineering, apparently. That's not bad, it's only one spelling mistake. Engineering in Asia. So just to recap, hiring is important to all organizations. I think everyone agrees you need great people to do great things. Hiring is really hard. Try to think about the four key areas that I've just mentioned. Hiring really is a situation where the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So try to think of those areas. It's not a static thing. You don't just think about it once and then never deal with it again. Keep iterating, keep experimenting, and most importantly, start sharing what you learn. Lots of people are struggling with this, and lots of people are having a bad time with it. So the more we talk about it, the more we share. I think you should let the mission and opportunity in your company sell the company rather than hold on to some secret sauce interview process. And that is it. I'm trying to take a break from social media, so I'm not tweeting or Facebooking or anything like that, but I am doing email. So if there's anything that I said that you would like me to talk about more or go into it deeper, there's the email address I'm using at the moment, and I'll be kicking around for the next couple of days. So thanks again for your time, and yeah. I appreciate I'm keeping you from your lunch, so don't worry.